When I moved into my son's house after retirement, I thought I was stepping into peace at last. My body was tired, my hands were worn, but my heart was full of hope. I imagined evenings filled with laughter, mornings of shared breakfasts, the comfort of family after so many years of giving. Instead, I found myself holding a broom handed to me by the woman my son married, her voice sharp and cold. "If you want to stay here, work for it." At first I thought she was joking. My smile was weak, searching her face for even a hint of kindness, but there was none. My son stood behind her, silent, his eyes darting between us. He didn't stop her. He didn't speak. That silence was louder than any words. It told me everything. From that day, my role was clear. Not as a mother, not as a guest, not as family. I was the maid in the house I thought would be my refuge. Morning to night, I scrubbed floors, washed clothes, polished furniture, cooked meals that I rarely ate. They sat at the table together while I hovered in the kitchen, waiting until they were finished to take the scraps. I told myself it was temporary, that it was easier than living alone, that at least I wasn't cold and hungry. But loneliness has many faces, and being invisible in your own family is the cruelest kind of loneliness. I used to sit by the window late at night, my knees aching, my fingers stiff, and look at the stars. I whispered to my husband, long gone from this world, did we raise him wrong? Did we give too much? My heart ached with every memory of the boy I once held in my arms, the boy who used to run into the house shouting, "Mama, Mama, look what I drew for you," the boy I stayed awake for at night, mending his clothes by the faint glow of a candle because we couldn't afford electricity some months. That boy was gone, and in his place was a man who let his wife treat me like dirt. I remember the winters of my youth, when I worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. In the mornings I cleaned other people's houses, scrubbing bathrooms on my hands and knees until the smell of bleach stung my nose and made my eyes water. In the evenings I worked at a laundry shop folding endless shirts, pressing collars until my wrists burned. Some nights I came home with nothing but coins in my pocket, and I would pour them onto the table, counting everyone to see if it was enough for bread and milk. If it wasn't, I went hungry. But my son never did. He always had food, always had clean clothes, always had a mother who protected him from the harsh world outside. When he was little, he once asked me why I never bought anything nice for myself. I smiled and told him, "Because my nice things are you." He laughed, not understanding, and I thought one day he would. One day he would know what it meant to give, without expecting anything back. I was wrong. Now in his house, I found myself repeating the same motions I had once done to keep him alive. Scrubbing, cooking, serving, but this time, not out of love, not out of choice, but because I was told to. My body wasn't young anymore. My back ached after 10 minutes of sweeping. My hands swelled from arthritis, and my legs shook when I stood too long. Yet if I slowed down, Rachel's eyes cut into me like knives. "Are you tired already?" she would say, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you should rest at a nursing home." The word nursing home echoed in my chest like a threat. I had seen women my age locked away in those places, forgotten by their families, sitting in wheelchairs staring at blank walls. I didn't want to end like that, so I stayed quiet. I worked. I swallowed the humiliation. Sometimes, when I ironed my son's shirts, I remembered the day I pawned my wedding ring to buy him a graduation suit. My husband had died years earlier, and we had nothing left. That ring was the only piece of him I still carried. But when I saw the way my son's face lit up in that suit, I told myself it was worth it. Every sacrifice was worth it. But now, watching him walk past me without a glance, I wondered if he even remembered. At night, I lay on a thin mattress in the small storage room they gave me, surrounded by boxes and dust. Through the walls, I could hear them laughing in their bedroom, the television blaring, the sound of glasses clinking. I would press my hands together and whisper prayers into the darkness, asking God to remind me I wasn't invisible. Sometimes I would fall asleep with tears drying on my cheeks, my dreams filled with memories of a time when my home was filled with love, not contempt. One evening I overheard them talking in the living room. Rachel's voice was sharp. "Your mother is slowing down. She's not much help anymore." My son sighed. "She's old, Rachel. What do you expect?" "Then why is she here?" Rachel snapped. "We can't just feed an extra mouth for nothing. She should be grateful we even let her stay." I stood frozen in the hallway, clutching the laundry basket to my chest, every word slicing through me. Grateful, as if raising him, feeding him, keeping him alive had been nothing, as if my existence was a burden they carried out of pity. I wanted to walk in and scream, to tell them everything I gave up, everything I lost, everything I endured for him, but the words stayed trapped in my throat, heavy and useless. Instead, I went back to my little room and cried into the pillow, silent sobs shaking my frail body. The next morning, Rachel handed me a long list. "Today, you'll polish the windows, scrub the bathroom tiles, and make lasagna for dinner. Oh, and don't forget to vacuum the upstairs. Michael invited some friends over tonight." She turned and walked away without waiting for a response. I looked down at the list, my hands trembling. Each task felt like a mountain, and yet I had no choice but to climb. As I bent over the bathroom tiles, scrubbing until my back burned, I remembered my younger days, the years when I carried heavy buckets of water because we didn't have plumbing, the days I stood in factory lines, sewing seams until my eyes blurred. Back then I told myself all the suffering had a purpose, that it was for my child, my future, our survival. But what purpose did this humiliation serve now? Why was I, an old woman who had given her life, still forced to prove her worth with a mop and bucket? That night, when his friends arrived, the house was spotless, the table set with steaming dishes, every plate filled with food I had cooked. I stood in the kitchen wiping my hands on a towel, waiting to be called to sit with them. No one called. I listened to their laughter, their clinking glasses, their stories. I brought in dessert quietly, placing it on the table while Rachel smiled and said, "Oh, mother-in-law is so helpful in the kitchen. She keeps busy." They laughed politely, their eyes sliding past me, as if I were just part of the furniture. I wanted to disappear, but then something unexpected happened. One of the guests, a woman around my age, followed me back into the kitchen. She looked at me, really looked at me, her eyes narrowing as she studied my tired hands, my hunched back, the sweat still clinging to my forehead. "Are you the maid?" she asked softly. The question hit me like a slap. My lips parted, but no words came out. Before I could answer, Rachel swept into the kitchen, her smile tight. "She just helps out sometimes," she said, quickly, grabbing the woman's arm and steering her back toward the table. But the woman turned her head and looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with something Rachel couldn't fake, pity. And in that look I realized the truth. My silence had allowed them to rewrite who I was. To them, I wasn't a mother. I wasn't family. I was just a maid. And something deep inside me, something I thought was long buried, began to stir. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of the little storage room, the words echoing over and over in my mind. "Are you the maid?" A stranger had seen what I had been trying to deny. I pressed my wrinkled hands together, rough and cracked from years of work, and whispered into the silence, "I am not a maid. I am his mother." My voice shook, and the words felt fragile, as if even I didn't fully believe them anymore. The next morning, Rachel avoided looking at me. She was sharper than usual, her tone clipped, as if she needed to reassert control. "The windows are streaky. Did you even clean them yesterday?" she said, tapping her manicured finger against the glass. I bent closer, ashamed, though I could barely see the lines she meant. My eyes weren't what they used to be, but I scrubbed again, the cloth scratching across the pane until my arms trembled. Behind me, she muttered, "If you can't handle simple tasks, maybe it's time we looked at other options." Other options. The words chilled me. I knew what she meant. The nursing home. I had seen neighbours shipped off to those places, their houses sold, their names erased. They were alive, but already buried. I gripped the cloth tighter and scrubbed harder. My worth was tied to these spotless windows, these gleaming tiles, these meals on the table. Later that afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table peeling potatoes. My hands were slow, stiff with arthritis, and the peels fell unevenly. My grandson Daniel wandered in, holding his toy car. He watched me for a moment and then asked, "Grandma, why are you always cleaning?" His innocent question sliced deeper than Rachel's cruelty ever could. I forced a smile and said, "Because I want to help." He tilted his head, confused, and then darted away to play. He didn't know that his little question echoed in my chest long after he was gone. In the evenings when the house grew quiet, I allowed myself small moments of escape. I would sit by the window looking out at the street lights and let memories flood me. Memories of my son as a boy, running barefoot through the grass, his hair wild in the wind. Memories of his laughter echoing in our old kitchen as I fried pancakes on Sunday mornings. Memories of holding him against my chest when he was sick, whispering prayers into his hair that smelled of soap and sunshine. Those memories were warm, but they carried a bitter edge now. How could the boy who once clung to me like I was his whole world now watch me scrub his floors like a servant? One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I pulled out an old shoebox from under my mattress. Inside were letters I had written over the years but never sent. Letters to my husband after his death. Letters to my son when he moved away. Letters filled with words I never had the courage to speak. I read one from 20 years ago, written the night I pawned my wedding ring. I sold the last piece of you today, but I did it for him. I hope you understand. I hope he will too one day. My tears blurred the ink. I wondered if that day would ever come. The days blurred together in an endless rhythm of chores and silence. Scrub, cook, fold, endure. My body grew weaker, but my spirit refused to break completely. Something in me, small but fierce, held on. Perhaps it was the look in that guest's eyes, the reminder that the world still saw me as more than a broom in my hand. Perhaps it was the echo of my husband's voice in my heart, urging me to stand tall. Then came the dinner party that changed everything. Rachel had invited important guests, her boss and his wife, people she wanted to impress. For days she barked orders at me, her voice growing sharper as the date approached. Polish the silverware, make sure the wine glasses sparkle, and for heaven's sake don't embarrass me. I worked from dawn to dusk, my hands blistered, my back aching, but I kept going. By the time the guests arrived, the house shone like glass, and the table groaned under the weight of food I had prepared. I hovered in the kitchen, listening to their laughter spill through the doorway. Rachel's voice was loud, filled with false sweetness, as she boasted about her cooking, her home, her family. My chest tightened. Those were my meals on the table, my sweat in every polished corner. But I was invisible, erased from the story she presented to the world. At one point I carried out a tray of desserts. Rachel introduced me quickly, her smile stiff. "This is Michael's mother. She stays with us and helps around the house." Helps around the house. The words hung in the air like dust. The boss's wife, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair, studied me closely, Her gaze lingered on my worn hands, the stoop of my shoulders, the quiet sorrow in my eyes. When I returned to the kitchen, she followed. She closed the door softly behind her and asked, almost in a whisper, "Why do they treat you like staff? You're his mother, aren't you?" Her voice was gentle, but her words cut through me. My throat tightened and I couldn't answer. She sighed, her expression heavy with pity. "I've seen this before," she murmured. "Children who forget the hands that raised them." She touched my arm lightly. "Don't let them erase you." Tears burned my eyes, but I blinked them back. For the first time in years someone had seen me, not the maid, not the burden, but the mother. Her words planted a seed deep inside me, a seed that would grow in the days to come. After the guests left, Rachel stormed into the kitchen. "What did you say to her?" she demanded. She looked at me strangely all evening. I shook my head. "Nothing," I whispered, but Rachel's suspicion hung in the air like smoke. My son said nothing, as always. His silence was a wall between us, thicker than stone. That night, I lay in bed staring at the shadows on the ceiling. The woman's words echoed in my mind. "Don't let them erase you." My fingers traced the lines of my palms, each wrinkle a story, each scar a sacrifice. I thought of the years I had given, the nights I had gone hungry, the dreams I had buried. I thought of the boy who once called me his hero, now treating me like hired help. Something inside me hardened. I could no longer be silent. The following week I began to write. Again, not letters to the dead, but a journal of the living. I wrote down every task I did, every word Rachel spoke, every silence from my son. I wrote about the sacrifices of the past, the pain of the present, the flicker of hope for the future. Each page felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a reminder that I still existed, that my story was not over. Rachel noticed the change. "You seem distracted lately," she said one afternoon as I peeled carrots. I shrugged. "Just tired," I murmured, but inside I was awake for the first time in years, awake to the injustice, awake to the truth, awake to the possibility that things could change. The moment of change came sooner than I expected. Another dinner was planned, this time for my son's colleagues. Again I cooked, I cleaned, I prepared. But this time I carried myself differently. My back was straighter, my eyes clearer. When the guests arrived, I served them with quiet dignity, not as a maid, but as a woman who knew her worth, even if no one else in that house did. One of the guests, a young man new to the company, looked at me with surprise. "Is this your mother?" he asked my son directly. The room fell silent. My son hesitated, then nodded awkwardly. "Yes." The young man smiled warmly at me. "It's an honor to meet you. Your son speaks highly of his family." I studied my son's face, searching for shame, for regret, for love. He avoided my gaze, but in that silence I felt a shift. Others had seen, others knew, and deep inside I knew the day was coming when I would no longer bow my head, no longer swallow the humiliation, no longer let them define me. The seed had sprouted, the roots were growing, my time was coming. The days after that second dinner were heavy with silence. My son hardly spoke to me, his eyes full of something I couldn't name, shame, perhaps, or fear of confrontation. Rachel's words grew sharper, as though my very presence unsettled her. She moved through the house like a storm, slamming doors, barking orders, reminding me with every glance that I was not wanted, but something inside me had shifted. I was no longer the same woman who swallowed humiliation like bitter medicine. Each cruel word, Each dismissive gesture now landed differently, not as a wound, but as fuel. I wrote more in my journal, filling page after page with truths I had kept locked away. I wrote about the winters when I froze my hands washing clothes in icy water. I wrote about the nights I sewed clothes for neighbours just to buy him medicine when he was sick. I wrote about the mornings I walked to work with holes in my shoes while he went to school in clean ones. My life was there, ink on paper, undeniable, unerasable. Rachel noticed. One evening, she burst into my little room without knocking, her eyes narrowing at the notebook in my lap. "What's that?" she demanded. I closed it gently and said, "Memories." She sneered. "You have too much time on your hands." "Maybe I should find more chores for you." I held her gaze for the first time in years. "Do what you like," I said softly. Something flickered in her eyes, confusion, maybe even fear. But she turned on her heel and left without another word. That night, I dreamed of my husband. He stood in the doorway of our old home, smiling the way he used to when he came in from work. His shoulders stooped, but his eyes bright. He reached out his hand to me and said, "Stand tall." I woke with tears on my cheeks and a strength in my chest I hadn't felt in decades. The next morning, as I was scrubbing the kitchen floor, Daniel padded in, his toy car clutched in his small hand. He crouched beside me, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Grandma, why don't you sit with us at dinner?" he asked. I froze, my brush still in my hand. "Because I need to finish my work," I said gently. He frowned. "But you're not the maid, you're my grandma." The innocence of his words broke me. I pulled him into my arms, holding him close, as silent tears slipped down my face. He didn't understand why I was crying, but he hugged me back, his little arms strong around my neck. That moment planted another seed. Perhaps one day he would remember his grandmother, not as the tired old woman with a broom, but as someone who loved him fiercely, who endured more than he could ever imagine. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. Rachel had gone out shopping, leaving me to prepare dinner. My son came home early from work, drenched and weary. He stood in the kitchen doorway, watching me knead dough with stiff fingers. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a low voice, he whispered, "Mom, do you hate me?" The question startled me. I looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like years. They were tired, bloodshot, but behind them I saw the boy he once was. My throat tightened. "No," I said softly, "I could never hate you, but I am disappointed." The word hung between us like smoke. His shoulders sagged, and for the briefest moment I thought he might cry. But then Rachel's car pulled into the driveway, and he straightened, his face closing like a door. He left without another word. That night, as they sat at the table eating the meal I had cooked, I stayed in the kitchen as usual, but I heard Rachel's laughter, sharp and mocking, and my son's forced chuckles. Something inside me snapped. I wiped my hands, walked into the dining room, and stood at the head of the table. The room fell silent. "I am not your maid," I said, my voice trembling but loud enough to fill the room. "I am your mother. This food is mine. This house was built on my hands, and I will not be invisible anymore." Rachel's face turned red with fury. "How dare you speak to us like that?" she hissed. My son stared at his plate, frozen, caught between us. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't look away. I turned and walked back to my room, my knees shaking but my spine straight. The next morning I expected punishment, More chores, sharper words, perhaps even the dreaded conversation about sending me away. Instead, the house was strangely quiet. My son left early for work. Rachel barely looked at me. The silence stretched for days, heavy, but not unbearable. I spent the time writing, filling my journal with the story of my life. Then one afternoon the unexpected happened. The woman from the first dinner party, Rachel's boss's wife, returned. She knocked on the door, holding a basket of fruit and flowers. "I came to see you," she said kindly when I opened it. Rachel's face paled, but she couldn't refuse her. The woman stepped inside, her eyes seeking me immediately. She sat with me in the kitchen, her voice gentle. "I can't stop thinking about you," she admitted. "You deserve better than this." She leaned closer. "I run a small cafe downtown. We could use someone like you, not for cleaning, but for heart. Someone who knows how to tell stories, how to make people feel at home." My hands shook as I held the edge of the table. A cafe, a chance to step outside, to be seen, to belong. Rachel sputtered from the doorway. "She's too old. She can't—" But the woman silenced her with a sharp look. "She can," she said firmly. That night, I lay awake thinking about the offer. Fear gnawed at me. Could I really leave the house? Could I really step into the world again at my age? But beneath the fear was something stronger. Hope. A fragile, glowing ember, I thought, had died long ago. The next day I accepted. Rachel scoffed. "Fine, go wear yourself out. Just don't expect us to pick up your slack." But I ignored her. My son said nothing, but I saw a flicker in his eyes, surprise, maybe even respect. My first day at the cafe was overwhelming. The smell of coffee, the hum of conversation, the clatter of cups. It was life, vibrant and real. The woman introduced me to the staff, young people with bright smiles who called me grandma before the day was done. I poured tea, served pastries, listened to customers share their stories, and in return I shared mine. Not all of it, not the darkest parts, but enough to make them laugh, to make them nod in understanding. For the first time in years, I felt human again. When I returned to the house that evening, tired but glowing, Rachel raised an eyebrow. "So how was your little adventure?" she sneered. I smiled, the lines around my mouth deepening. "It was wonderful." She scowled, but for once her words didn't touch me. The days that followed brought change. I spent less time with a broom in my hand, more time at the cafe. Customers began to ask for me by name. "Where's Grandma?" they'd say if I wasn't there. I told them stories about my childhood, about the war, about the struggles of raising a son alone. Some cried, some laughed, all listened. I was no longer invisible, and slowly the balance at home began to shift. Rachel no longer ordered me about so freely. My son, though still quiet, began to show small gestures, a cup of tea placed by my side, a chair pulled out for me at dinner. They were tiny cracks in the wall he had built, but they were cracks nonetheless. I didn't forgive him yet. My wounds were too deep, my heart too heavy. But I no longer felt powerless. I no longer felt erased. I had found a piece of myself again, and I wasn't going to let it go. One evening, as I sat at the cafe after closing, the woman placed a hand on mine. "You remind me of my own mother," she said softly. "Strong, unbreakable." My eyes filled with tears. "I don't feel strong," I whispered. She smiled. "Strength isn't about how much you carry. It's about how many times you refuse to be broken." Her words sank deep into my soul. For the first time in years, I believed them. The cafe became my sanctuary. Each morning, I woke not to Rachel's orders, but to the smell of coffee beans and the warmth of greetings from people who actually saw me. My hands, though stiff, found new purpose in pouring tea, arranging pastries, and holding the hands of strangers who unburdened their hearts to me. They called me Grandma, with affection, not mockery. For the first time in years I laughed without forcing it. But at home tension grew. Rachel seethed each time she saw me leave with my worn handbag and a small smile on my lips. "You're embarrassing us," she spat one morning, running around like a desperate old woman. "What will people think of us?" I met her gaze, my back straighter than it had been in years. "They will think I am alive," I said simply. She faltered, her mouth opening and closing without words. For once she had no reply. My son watched all of this quietly. His silence was still a wound, but now it cut differently. It was no longer the silence of dismissal, but of shame. Sometimes I caught him staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. His eyes were heavy, as if the weight of unspoken words was dragging him down. Then came the night that changed everything. Rachel had organized yet another dinner party, this time with family and neighbors. She wanted to display her perfect household, her perfect life. I worked all day preparing food, though this time I did it with calm, not desperation. I knew my worth didn't depend on polished floors or spotless dishes anymore, but still I cooked with love, because love, despite everything, was the only thing I had never lost. The guests arrived, laughter filling the house. Rachel preened and boasted as always. My son sat stiffly at the table, his smile thin. I moved quietly through the kitchen, serving dishes, refilling glasses, and then, as if fate itself had intervened, the woman from the cafe, the boss's wife who had first seen me, walked in with her husband. Rachel's face drained of colour. She hadn't invited them, but they had been included through mutual friends. When the woman saw me, her eyes lit up. "There you are," she exclaimed warmly. The room fell silent. "Everyone at the cafe adores her," she continued, smiling at the others. "She's the heart of the place. You should see how people line up just to hear her stories." Murmurs rippled through the guests. Rachel's forced smile quivered. My son's face burned red. For the first time the truth spilled into the room, undeniable, uncontainable. One neighbour leaned forward. "I thought she was just helping around the house." The question hung heavy, thick with accusation. Rachel stammered, searching for words. But before she could, I stepped forward. My hands trembled, but my voice was steady. "I am not a maid," I said, each word sharp and clear. "I am a mother. I gave my youth, my strength, my very soul to raise the man sitting at this table. I worked until my bones ached, until my hands bled, so he could have a life better than mine. And when I was tired, when I had nothing left, I came here, not for comfort, not for luxury, but for love. Instead, I was handed a broom. The room was silent. Faces shifted with shock, pity, even shame. My son lowered his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. Rachel's lips tightened, her eyes cold as stone, but her mask was cracking. I continued, my voice softening but carrying through the room. "Do you know what it feels like to be invisible in your own family? To cook meals you're not allowed to share? To clean floors that will never welcome your tired feet? to live in a house built on your sacrifices and be treated as a burden. My throat burned, but I pushed through. I am not invisible. Not anymore. Tears blurred my vision, but I stood tall, my back straighter than it had been in decades. For once I didn't feel like the maid in the shadows. I felt like a mother again, flawed, weary, but unbroken. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then the woman from the cafe placed her hand on mine and said loudly, "You deserve better." And now everyone here knows it. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some murmured agreement. Rachel's perfect image crumbled before their eyes. My son looked up at me, his face streaked with tears. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I'm sorry." The words were small, almost fragile, but they pierced me. For years I had longed to hear them, yet they were not enough. Not yet. After the guests left, Rachel exploded. "You humiliated us. You made us look like fools," she screamed, her voice shrill with rage. I stood in the doorway, calm. "I did nothing but speak the truth," I replied. My son said nothing, his face pale, his eyes hollow. For once Rachel's fury didn't touch me. I turned and walked back to my little room, closing the door behind me. The next morning I packed a small bag. My journal, a change of clothes, and a photo of my husband. My son stood in the doorway, his voice hoarse. "Where will you go?" I looked at him, my heart breaking and healing at the same time. "Where people see me," I said. I moved into a small room above the cafe. The owners welcomed me like family. My days were filled with laughter, stories, and the warmth of strangers who became friends. At night I sat by the window, the city lights twinkling below, and I no longer felt invisible. Weeks passed. One evening, as I was closing the cafe, my son walked in. He looked thinner, older, his eyes tired. He sat at a table, his hands shaking. "I don't deserve to be here," he said quietly, "but I had to see you." I sat across from him, my heart pounding. He took a deep breath. "I let her treat you like that. I let myself believe that silence would protect me, but it only destroyed us. I am ashamed, Mom, ashamed of what I became." Tears filled my eyes, but I didn't speak. He reached across the table, his hand trembling. "Please, give me a chance to make it right." I looked at his hand, then at his face, the boy I once cradled, the man who had broken me, the son I still loved despite everything. Slowly, I placed my hand over his. "Love is not something you earn or lose," I whispered, "but respect is. And now, you must earn it." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in years I saw the boy he once was, the boy who had drawn pictures for me, who had called me his hero. Maybe he was still in there, buried beneath mistakes and silence. Maybe. I returned to the cafe that night, with a heart heavy but lighter than it had been in years. My wounds were still there, but they no longer defined me. I was more than the maid, more than the burden. I was a woman who had endured, who had survived, who had found her voice again. And as I locked the doors and looked out at the stars, I whispered to my husband, I stood tall. The cafe became more than just a place of work for me. It became a place of rebirth. Every morning, when I pushed open the glass door and heard the soft chime of the bell, I felt like I was stepping into a second life. The air smelled of freshly ground coffee beans and warm bread, and the sound of chatter wrapped around me like a blanket. People came in carrying the weight of their lives. and somehow when they left they walked a little lighter. It wasn't because of the coffee or the pastries, it was because of stories. I told them mine, pieces of it, never all at once. I spoke of the years of sacrifice, of the strength it took to keep going when there was nothing left, of the small joys that carried me through the darkest nights. And as I spoke, I saw people's eyes soften, their shoulders relax. They listened. They cared. They saw me. Sometimes young mothers came in with tired eyes and restless children. I would sit with them, rocking the babies on my lap, whispering lullabies I once sang to my own son. It gets easier, I told them, though I knew it didn't always. What it did get was worth it, worth the sleepless nights, worth the sacrifices, worth the aching body that came from carrying more than your share of life's burdens. Other times older men and women would linger at my table, their eyes full of unspoken sorrow. They told me stories of children who no longer visited, of houses too quiet, of days that dragged on without purpose. I listened, holding their hands, nodding through tears, and in those moments I realized I was not alone. So many of us carried the same wound, the wound of giving everything and being forgotten. But together, in that little cafe, we remembered we were still alive, still worthy, still human. At night, I often returned to my small room above the cafe and opened my journal. The pages were thick with words now, filled with my story in all its pain and beauty. I wrote not only for myself, but for those who came after me. One day I thought, my grandson might read these pages. He would see not just the tired old woman who scrubbed floors, but the fighter who never gave up, the woman who loved too deeply to be erased. My son began to visit more often. At first he came timidly, sitting in the corner of the cafe, watching me from afar. Then slowly he began to approach. He would help wipe tables, refill glasses, sometimes even join in the conversations. He was awkward, weighed down by guilt, but he was trying, and though my heart still carried scars, I allowed him that chance, for love is not a switch you can turn off. It is a river that runs, no matter how many stones are thrown into it. Rachel, however, rarely came. Her pride was too thick, her resentment too deep, but I no longer let her absence wound me. I had spent too many years measuring my worth by the coldness of others. Now I measured it by the warmth of strangers who had become family, by the laughter that echoed through the cafe, by the strength I saw each morning when I looked into the mirror and saw a woman who refused to be broken. One evening, as the cafe was closing, my grandson Daniel ran in, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Grandma, Grandma!" he shouted, waving a drawing in his small hands. I knelt down, my knees creaking, and took the paper from him. It was a picture of a woman with grey hair, standing behind a counter, surrounded by people smiling. Above her head, in clumsy letters, he had written, "My grandma is a hero." Tears blurred my vision as I pulled him into my arms. In that simple drawing he had given me what I had longed for all these years, not recognition, not repayment, but love, pure, untainted love. That night I sat by my window, the city lights twinkling like stars, and I thought back on my life. I remembered the girl I once was, barefoot and hungry, dreaming of a better tomorrow. I remembered the young mother, weary but determined, cradling her baby with hands that never stopped working. I remembered the widow, standing alone but refusing to crumble. And I remembered the old woman with a broom, nearly erased, who found her voice again. Life had not been kind. It had stripped me bare, tested me, humiliated me, but it had also taught me the deepest truths, that survival is a victory, that love is both a blessing and a wound, that hope can flicker even in the darkest rooms. I am no longer the maid in my son's house. I am the storyteller in a cafe, the grandmother who still sings lullabies, the woman who stood tall when the world tried to bend her. If there is one lesson my life has taught me, it is this: never let anyone erase your worth. You are not defined by the cruelty of others, but by the love you carry, the battles you fight, and the dignity you refuse to surrender. Thanks for listening, and tell me in the comments section where you are watching from, because I love to connect with people and I read all your comments. And please like the video of you love this story and subscribe to listen more like this. Take care.